Hello, and welcome to Why Do We Do That? A psychology podcast that deconstructs human behavior from the perspectives of social scientists, psychologists, and others that use applied psychology in their work. I'm your host, Dr. Ryan Moyer. In this episode, I sat down with Dr. Pierre to discuss the topics of mistrust, disinformation, and motivated reasoning. Joe is my first repeat guest, appearing in episode 30 entitled Conspiracy Theory Beliefs. Joe is a health sciences clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of California, San Francisco. He's a graduate of MIT, the UCLA School of Medicine, and the Psychiatry Residency Training Program at the UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute. He has extensive clinical experience working with individuals with psychotic disorders and substance use disorders. Joe has authored over 100 papers, abstracts, and book chapters related to schizophrenia and delusions, and writes the Psych Unseen blog at Psychology Today. His new book is called False: How Mistrust, Disinformation, and Motivated Reasoning Make Us Believe Things That Aren't True, and was the focus of our conversation. One of my main takeaways from my conversation with Joe was just how easily we fall into the trap of believing we are rational, objective thinkers. In reality, our minds are shaped by a complex web of cognitive biases that subtly distort how we process information, especially on issues that feel personal or politically charged. These mental shortcuts don't necessarily bring us closer to the truth. More often, they steer us toward conclusions that reinforce what we already believe. Another insight that stood out was the importance of critically examining our most trusted sources of information. The internet, while vast and seemingly diverse, often isolates us in ideological echo chambers. Algorithms are designed to feed us content that aligns with our preferences, articles, videos, and voices that affirm our existing worldview. This can create a false sense of clarity, as if our understanding of the world is both comprehensive and unquestionably accurate. While many of our favorite thinkers help contextualize news, science, and history, we should be mindful not to mistake curated insight for complete understanding. True intellectual growth comes from engaging with genuine curiosity in conversations with those who see the world differently. If you are a regular consumer of news and feel confident in your ability to separate fact from fiction, this episode might give you reason to pause and reflect on just how easily even the sharpest minds can be misled. Enjoy. Okay, today I am joined once again by Pierre. Thank you so much for being on today.
Thank you for having me back. Pleasure.
Yes. For the listeners, if you go back to episode 30, you will be able to listen to another conversation with Joe and I, specifically around conspiracy theories. A very fun episode. And today's topic is related to the topic of conspiracy theories, but perhaps much, much more broad. We're going to be talking about Joe's new book, which is called False: How Mistrust, Disinformation, and Motivated Reasoning Make Us Believe Things That Aren't True. I really enjoyed it. Anything that gets into the nuts and bolts of beliefs and attitudes piques my interest. That also overlaps with some of my graduate training. So I'm looking forward to chatting about some of the ideas in the book. Why don't we start with what I might call the institutions of information, and how over the last 50 years, it seems that the way that we gain information and form our opinions has changed drastically. The way news has evolved, the way technology has evolved. Before we get into the core thinking mechanisms behind why we believe things that aren't true. Could you talk about the last 50 years and what are the meaningful changes in terms of how our beliefs and opinions are formed?
Sure. Well, I'll start with just a very quick overview of some of the different reasons why we believe things, the reasons that we use to justify our beliefs. So the first would be intuition, just a sense that this something is or is not true. Stephen Colbert famously referred to that as truthiness, just feels true.
Mhm.
So that's one way we justify belief. Another is based on our own personal or subjective experience, right? We might be told something about the way the world works, but if my experience is different, then, I tend to believe my own experience. A third reason would be faith, which in the book I describe as an act of believing, even though the evidence is not necessarily there. Um, and the fourth one, which is relevant to the question you're asking, is trust in what other people tell us, trust in the testimony of others. And so I don't think that intuition or personal experience or faith has changed all that much over the past 50 years, but trust in the testimony of others has changed drastically because we, compared to 50 years ago, have access to much more information from other people. I often tell my own personal experience about this, which I detail in the book, which is that when I was, I'm in my 50s. So when I was in my youth growing up in the 1970s, our family subscribed to one newspaper. We had, I think it was four different network TV news shows that
Right.
we had to choose from. And, we did subscribe to the occasional magazine or two. And if I had a school assignment to do, back in the old days, we had these things called book reports, right? That would mean that I would have to bike down to the library, check out a book, or, some families had this, the multi-volume Encyclopedia Britannica. So that we just had access to a lot fewer sources of information 50 years ago. Now, of course, that couldn't be more different, right? Our kids would probably just marvel at how limited our access to information was. And it's not just the internet, it's also what happened with television, with the rise of cable TV. Now it's no longer for, main networks. It's also, many, many other cable news providers. And I think something else that we've seen is a steering away from objective news reporting, journalism. That still exists, but there's now, I would argue, much more news commentary. And so the people that we watch on TV or listen to on the radio, or, for that matter, they didn't have podcasts 50 years ago, right?
Right.
So now we've got podcasts and Substacks and blogs and all these different sources of information. And that really has changed because it has become what some people have referred to as a democratization of information. Now,
Right.
any of us can start our own Substack or start our own podcast. Um, and if we're on social media, we can post right alongside the New York Times or the Washington Post or whatever sort of official journalistic media outlet there is. And
Yeah,
so
and
there,
yeah.
there, that,
Go ahead.
yeah, just to end on that, I think there's now this blurring between, what is so-called facts versus opinions, what's news commentary versus objective news reporting. And I would argue that for the most part, we haven't really been taught, in school, or for those of us who are long out of school, there's not ongoing education to help us be better consumers of that diversity of information.
Yeah, you couldn't buy a different set of encyclopedias that fit your preconsistent your predefined ideas in 1995. Whereas now you can allow the internet to guide you or sway you in ways that your eyes are going to go towards ideas that you find interesting, right? There's this kind of gatekeeping process where once and you talk about this idea of quote unquote doing your own research and how that can be very dangerous, but when we set out to learn, it is so much easier to be pulled, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, into these rabbit holes or directions or websites or even personalities that essentially pass our test of, ooh, I like that idea. Let me explore further. And it's almost always starting with, ooh, that fits what I know. Let me go a little bit deeper, right?
That's right. And I do want to say from the outset that I am not advocating that we go back to where we were 50 years ago, where we only had limited source of information. I mean, make no mistake, the fact that we have a much more diverse range of opinions now, I think is a really good thing.
Yeah.
I think, though, in theory, what the hope of that, the hope of having all those different opinions is that the truth would sort of rise to the top. Um, and so in the book, I talk about, there's a concept of the free market of opinion. So that that it's been democratized, everyone now can say what they want to say. But again, the idea would be that in a free market, the best product rises to the top. And I think the flip side of that is, yes, it's a good thing to have a diversity of perspectives, but unfortunately, what that has also meant is that we have much greater access to misinformation and not good sources of information. I often talk about how in the old days, or I guess even still today, you'd be in the grocery store checkout line, and that's where you would go to see articles about Hillary Clinton being a space alien or a robot, or, UFOs abducting people, right? Because we recognized that kind of tabloid journalism for what it was, a form of entertainment, and we knew where to locate it in the grocery store checkout line. Um, but now that kind of information is everywhere. So again, good that we have a lot more information, not so good that we have a lot more unreliable information, and that it often, because of how it's situated, it's not just in the grocery store checkout line, it's much more difficult to tell the two things apart. And so to respond to what you were saying, yeah, the idea of doing your own research indeed is one of my most unliked phrases, because it's really not, in the traditional sense, research. What it is somebody who starts saying, I have a question. There's also that phrase, I'm just asking questions and I'm looking for answers, which great, right? That's intellectual curiosity. That's a wonderful thing. But oftentimes those searches start with a kind of hunch, or they start from a place of distrust, right? I don't trust what, let's just say, the CDC has told me about vaccines. I've heard some other information about that not being reliable. And then you get online, and again, it's easy to find misinformation. But beyond that, the algorithms of the internet are really geared towards steering us to information that the algorithms, quote unquote, um, think we want to know. And it's just a matter of, what do you type in a search engine that cues the algorithms what you're interested in, and it steers you in that direction, which again, on the surface might not seem like a bad thing, except that's when we get into this idea of the echo chamber where you're being steered to specific information. In fact, I just had this conversation with my mother the other night, where she was talking about, what she's inundated with and what she never sees. And I said, well, that's so interesting, because for me, it's the exact opposite. I
Right.
see all the stuff you say you don't see, and I'm aware of, but I don't see the things that you're referring to. So sometimes I call that the tale of two alternate realities.
Yeah, it is unsettling. I mean, do you think that people are completely blind to that filter that the big sites do? Because we know that Facebook and sites like Twitter and TikTok for that matter, that they learn what you want to see, they serve you that. Do you think that people are truly blind to it, or do you think that they have an inclination that they're only seeing part of the story, but maybe when they try to correct, maybe they think to themselves, well, I see a lot of this. Like, I know that there are other counterexamples, but But I just don't think that's the majority, because you see oftentimes, at least when I talk to people, you can pretty quickly get them to admit that the internet's full of misinformation. You can't believe everything you read, and then they don't apply that critical eye when doing their own research. Um, Maybe it's just overconfidence. I'm not really sure, but do you think that people are completely blind to this filtering process that the sites are doing, or that they're just not correcting enough when they're formulating their ideas?
Yeah, I don't think I would say that they're blind to it. I mean, we all have the experience where you do an internet search. This just happened to me last month where, I'm thinking about maybe I need a new car, right? And I doing some research on new cars. And of course, what's now happened is that all over my, Facebook feed, for example, now I'm just getting inundated with these different things about not only the car that I was looking for, but, different ones in its class. And so I'm aware that that's happening. I'm aware that I'm getting steered towards that information. And of course, there are ways to minimize that. You go into your settings and you can, tweak how much that happens. But even if you tweak it, it still happens, right? Because that's how these sites actually generate revenue through targeted advertising. So my point, though, is that we're aware that it happens. We're not blind, but we want it to happen, right? The algorithms steer us to what we want to see because we do, in fact, want to see it. So it's actually pretty gratifying. And it's when we use the term echo chamber, we kind of think that it is this idea of blinders, right? Like that we don't see. And that's not really what echo chambers are. We are exposed to information that contradicts what we see, but within, the real idea of an echo chamber, or I think in the book I referred to this as an epistemic bubble, which is someone else's term for this. It's not that you're not exposed to the information, but within that social network and within what you're seeing, are reinforced to disregard the information that you don't agree with. So it's not for lack of exposure, it's just a way to disregard. And so to answer your question, yeah, I think what happens to all of us is that we tend to gravitate towards information that reinforces what we believe, helps reinforce our ideological identities. And so we all just assume, like you said, we know misinformation's out there. We know people have false beliefs, but we just assume, therefore, that it's those other people that don't agree with us. So I think that's what the process is. It's just very reinforcing.
So there's definitely some errors in thinking that contribute to developing of beliefs that are objectively not supported by evidence. We might call these cognitive biases, right? So anything that differentiates a human from thinking in an objective manner. So we have these default ways of thinking that steer us away from objective thinking. Could you talk about some of one to two of the big ones that contribute to our potential to be persuaded by ideas that aren't necessarily based in reality?
Yeah, well, I mean, to start, there are just so many of them, and I think that was actually one of the main motivations to write my book because I had, heard about these things as a psychiatrist, and I studied psychology as an undergrad, so I was exposed to these things. But in psychiatry, usually the emphasis is on psychopathology, right? So it's like, why do people with psychotic disorders believe things that aren't true? Or why does someone with clinical depression have, what we call cognitive distortions? Very little of it has been devoted to why do normal people like you and me have false beliefs? And so I really wanted to try to compile that in one place. And so to a certain extent, each chapter kind of delves into different ones. So what I would say is that some of the ones that have become household names that are covered in the book would be things like cognitive dissonance, right? Cognitive dissonance is a word that describes the sort of discomfort or tension that we feel when our own beliefs butt up against reality, right? When we're exposed to counter evidence. And what research in cognitive dissonance for going back many decades has shown is that the more time that we've spent with that belief or with a social group that has that belief, the less likely we are then to shift our beliefs. And in fact, we do the opposite. We tend to double down or we move the goalposts, right? We sort of change the belief or our prediction about the future. So that's discussed in the book. The other one that also I think has become a household word is the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? The idea that people with lower degrees of knowledge tend to be the most disproportionately confident that they are, in fact, very knowledgeable. But to answer your question, for me, the most key factor to think of when we think why do people believe things that aren't true is really confirmation bias, which I alluded to, just a moment ago. Confirmation bias means the natural tendency we all have to gravitate towards information that reinforces what we already believe or what we want to believe, and then to kind of ignore or swipe past information that refutes it or contradicts it. And there's a related concept, which is part of the subtitle of the book, which is motivated reasoning, which is sort of the same thing, sort of not. Motivated reasoning means not just what we do when we encounter information, but rather what we do when we actually read or digest or analyze the information. And so it's not about ignoring or paying attention to the way confirmation bias is. It's about appraising the quality of that information. So if I'm reading, again, if maybe I have some thoughts that vaccines, are bad for you. And so if I read a study saying, that it's been proven very clearly that vaccines do not cause autism, well, then I start to pick that apart. I say, yeah, but look, this is written by people who are in bed with big pharma. And, this was not a randomized controlled trial. This was a epidemiological study, right? So we pick apart and we say, yeah, I shouldn't need to pay attention to this because it's not good quality information. But then when I see the other study or piece of information that says what I do want to believe, then I say, see, now that's high quality information. And this explains why liberals right now think that CNN and MSNBC are great news sources and Fox is terrible, and the opposite, right? Conservatives think Fox or the Epoch Times is excellent, and the New York Times or the Washington Post is terrible.
It's also interesting how these beliefs kind of have a mixed impact on our behavior, because there's definitely a lot that goes on between belief and behavior. Your beliefs don't always predict your behavior, and I always found that piece to be very interesting. You see what we might call ideologues. Of course, right now RFK is the Secretary of Health and Human Services, noted anti-vaxxer. For the listeners, you do your own research if you want to refute my claim that he's an anti-vaxxer. I think he has a rich history of saying things that are anti-vaccination, but I still haven't been able to wrap my brain around what happens when people that have rich ideologies behave in ways that don't necessarily reflect that. So even someone like RFK, who's consistently thrown or put smoke into the conversation to muddy the water of whether or not vaccines are safe. RFK allegedly vaccinates his children. The recent outbreak in measles, it seems as though he okayed sending vaccines, additional vaccine resources to that area. How do you interpret these types of events in terms of what's going on in his head when these behaviors don't match his history of comments?
Well, good question. I mean, I will just say as a caveat that I have never met RFK Jr. I have not talked with him. I'd like to. I think it'd be fascinating. So I would not presume to know, what's going on in his head per se. But I can talk, generally, about some of the possibilities for people who have similar disconnects between stated beliefs and behavior. The first is just that when we think about belief, I think we often tend to think about it in a kind of absolute way, right? You believe something or you don't. But of course, that's not really the way we believe, right? We believe with different degrees. So when you do a poll and you ask about, do you believe something? you might get a certain percentage who say yes versus no. But if you use a different scale that says I believe it strongly, I believe it a little bit, I'm not sure, and different degradations, then you get much different answers. So sometimes when people say, "Oh, I believe in X," well, they don't believe it with the full force that it might necessarily alter their behavior. One example that comes to mind that I think is easy to relate to is, there are people who are atheists who don't believe in God, but then you talk to them and, turns out they actually pray sometimes. And you say, well, that's weird. Why are you praying you know, if you don't believe in God? And
Right.
sometimes the response is, so, well, maybe he exists. And so like, maybe I should, be in his good graces kind of thing. So I think that ties into this idea of like, how much do you believe? Um, Now, the darker answer, the sort of more pessimistic or discouraging answer, which may or may not apply to somebody like RFK, is, it's possible that what he says and what he promotes is not actually what he believes, right? That's the concept of disinformation, the putting information out there that is actually wrong, which you say, well, why would someone do that? Well, you might do that because, for example, my understanding of RFK Jr. is that's how he makes his income. His income is almost totally dependent on what he says about vaccines. He often acts as expert witness for legal cases where they're suing, big pharma vaccine makers and that kind of thing. So, like, that's his livelihood to say this. Now, what he does behind private doors, that might be a different question. So that's one possibility. A lot of people were speaking out during COVID, during the COVID pandemic about the evils of vaccines. And I often wondered, the Tucker Carlsons of the world,
Hmm.
like, did they actually get their vaccine or not? And I would love to know the answer to that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think examples like this often speak to this idea that oversimplifies bad beliefs in the sense of, oh, it's just an issue of intelligence. And I think it's overwhelmingly clear that maybe intelligence is correlated with some of these beliefs, but it is not the end all be all explanation for why you would believe something that's would be considered inconsistent with what we know of reality. Even that part of identifying ulterior motives, like sometimes you're having conversation with your friends and they are they're exhibiting the critical thinking to identify that beliefs may not always be based off of someone's take of the evidence. If you look at the ulterior motives of Joe Biden or something like that, you can see he had ulterior motives for promoting this policy or making this statement. And then there's this demonstration of critical thinking. And then you look at what their personal beliefs are. RFK, for example, like he makes money off of anti-vax merchandise, and I still don't understand why we're so good at critically thinking when it serves us, but we don't apply that critical thinking when it's on our side.
Yeah.
It definitely suggests, there's this identity piece that seems to go along with it that will weaponize our critical thinking in one way or the other, right?
That's exactly right. So, we talked about confirmation bias, we talked about motivated reasoning. Sometimes a sort of synonymous term that's used is my side bias, which is basically what you just said, right? A tendency to join with information or beliefs or other people who share those beliefs to reinforce the beliefs that we have. And again, an easy way to kind of appreciate this in a way that recognizes that we all do this is for anyone who watches sports, right? You're watching your team in the Super Bowl versus the team you don't want to win. There's a flag on the play, there's a penalty, and if it goes towards your side, you're like, yeah, that was an excellent call, ref. But if it goes against you and now you've lost the Super Bowl, it's, oh, that was a terrible call, ref. So psychological processes like confirmation bias and motivated reasoning tend to allow us to reinforce what we already believe. They allow us to feel good about ourselves. They allow us to feel like we don't have to admit that we're wrong. And I feel like our culture has sort of evolved in a direction now where it's like a terrible thing to admit that you're wrong. And President Obama, for example, was often criticized, I think, on both the left and the right, for being sort of overly deliberative, right? He didn't just act the way you think a leader should. He would think about things and get consultation and, weigh both sides. And that sort of, I think, is disincentivized in culture now, right? We want people who stand up for their beliefs, whereas I often feel like we should do the opposite. Maybe we should be standing down from our beliefs and not be so overly committed. But that's what these processes do. They allow us to be overcommitted, allow us to be overconfident, all in the service of making us feel good about ourselves, even though it's sort of a grandiose way of feeling good about ourselves.
Yeah. So we're eventually going to get to some solutions for how we can think a little bit better, maybe formulate our beliefs in a more objective way, and avoid these pitfalls of aligning our beliefs with our identity and what's important to us. But I before that, I want to talk a little bit about institutions a little bit more. Uh, you refer in the book to the disinformation industrial complex. What is the disinformation industrial complex?
Well, when we talk about information, there's a kind of familiar term that's sometimes used about informational ecosystems, right? The idea that information exists out there in the world and that people interact with it in different ways, similar to how you might do so in an ecological system. So when I talk about specifically misinformation, I like to talk about this idea of the disinformation food chain. And at the top of that food chain is what I refer to when I say the disinformation industrial complex. So within a food chain, you would call those the apex predators. So these are the people who are churning out the disinformation. And again, disinformation means deliberate, right? I'm churning out this information because I know it's not true, but I'm doing it for some other gain, which is usually financial gain or attracting eyes to my web page or becoming an influencer, right? There's no other better way to gain eyeballs and clicks, if you will, in an online environment than to say things that are completely outrageous, right? So I referred earlier to this idea of the free market of opinion. Well, when I talk about the flea market of opinion, right? FLEA, flea market, it's the idea is in a flea market, there's so many different choices, and you're going to gravitate to the one that is the most colorful, has the biggest display, the guy who's yelling the loudest, he's got, a trained monkey, I mean, like whatever, to capture our attention. And so that's really, I think, what's happening. So that gives you some insight as to why people within the disinformation industrial complex are doing that. They're doing that for profit or for power.
So you said that sometimes these disinformation industrial complexes that they preach information that they know isn't true. And that reminds me of some work by John Petrocelli, who researches bullshit, also was a guest on a previous episode of this podcast. And you actually talk about him in your book, and you talk about the idea of bullshit. And he talks about bullshit as being different from lying, because lying requires that you're intimately familiar with the truth, so that because you must be able to avoid the truth. Whereas bullshit is much more vague. It's all about, what might be true. There might be a gray area issue, and you take a bunch of disparate facts and you package them together, and then that's your conclusion from facts, like from real information. And it's the conclusion where you start to see the bullshit creep in. So to what extent do you think these, like, the larger forces, the Alex Jones of the world, and other bias, news outlets, to what extent are they lying versus just engaging in bullshit?
Yeah, well, I will definitely acknowledge that for someone like you or me, a third party who's looking in on the situation, it can be difficult, if not impossible, to know what that person, what they really believe. Same question you were asking earlier about, RFK Jr. and, whether or not he, to what extent does he really oppose vaccines? So that can be tricky. So when I say there's a disinformation industrial complex, I'm sort of saying, well, there are, I think, indisputably some people who are in fact misrepresenting the truth. Now, if we go further within that informational ecosystem or that disinformation food chain, the next step below is the mesopredator, right? The
Right.
mesopredator is someone who is both devoured by the apex predator, but also eats, the prey animals. So for the information metaphor, these are people who sometimes are making up their own content, sometimes might be engaging in disinformation, but just as often might be passing along the disinformation that comes from above unwittingly based on their belief on it. So creators of content or spreaders of content sometimes indeed are doing it unwittingly. Now, of course, I have a whole chapter on bullshit receptivity in the book, so I treat that a little bit separately. But I do talk about Alex Jones, and I think I mentioned Tucker Carlson as well, because both of them got into legal trouble based on some of the things that they claimed. And part of the defense had to do with like to what extent they actually believed, what they claimed. And in both cases, they sort of backpedaled and sort of, Alex Jones actually claimed that he was like had a little bit of psychosis and was sort of, kind of claiming that he was a mesopredator, that he was steered by information that was out there. Now, again, I've not spent time with him. I've not talked with him personally, so I can't say for sure what he does or not does not believe. But it really lends the idea that, yeah, I think he did know, but then he got in trouble and now he's backpedaling. So I do think there are people clearly that do peddle disinformation knowing that it's probably not true. But it's a gray area, right? And you might, know this X is untrue, but Y, which is related, maybe you buy that and you don't know. And that's why, those other phrases I mentioned, the just asking questions, the looking for answers, as if like, okay, good, I'm just intellectually curious and I'm open to everything. But as you were suggesting, that's not necessarily good critical thinking and trying to, praise that information.
You talk a lot about trust in the book and how that is sort of the fuel that can contribute to going down rabbit holes, and it all starts with the distrust of the big institutions, whether it's news, the medical community, stuff like that. What mistakes have the big institutions made to contribute to this lack of trust? Because part of me, even though I give the medical community the benefit of the doubt, I mean, primarily I give them the benefit of the doubt because I know what it's like to be in a position where you have to have official statements on things, and I know how murky it can get. Um, to to go from the boots on the ground who are doing the research all the way up to a single person who's giving a press release, right? There's just so much that goes on. I just tend to give institutions the benefit of the doubt. I'm a lot less critical and less conspiratorial than most people. But it does seem that institutions trip over themselves sometimes and also contribute to that mistrust. Uh, what's your view on the big mistakes that institutions can make that might increase this distrust?
Yeah, so to preface that answer, I will just repeat again that like in the book, I mean, in fact, the subtitle of the book has to do with mistrust, disinformation, and motivated reasoning. I actually like to use misinformation instead, so it's three M's, but the editors wanted me to not use alliteration, so they suggested disinformation. So for me, the three key things to think about, if you're trying to figure out why does someone believe something that seems ridiculous, you can often boil it down to those three things: mistrust, misinformation, and motivated reasoning. So, and you had mentioned before, I don't think I followed up on that, but you had mentioned that, intelligence may not be, the key feature. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. In fact, when we talk about things like motivated reasoning, which remember I said means, dissecting a study to decide, I don't think this is true, because it doesn't support what I want to believe. If I'm actually better at critical thinking, right? Like for somebody like me who used to be a researcher in medicine, I know a lot about study design. I do that. I review papers when they're up for peer review. So that actually counterintuitively can make people engage in motivated reasoning more because they're
Right.
better at it, right?
Right.
So intelligence in no way is protective. Anyway, to get back to mistrust, the reason I emphasize those three components, mistrust, misinformation, motivated reasoning, is because they're not really pathological, any of them, right? If I happen to believe information that's out there that's not true, it's not because I'm stupid. It's not because, even the idea of critical thinking, I think is a misunderstood term. So mistrust is not pathological. I mean, it can be, don't get me wrong, right? I could have a patient who I'm treating who has a psychotic disorder and is paranoid and therefore mistrusts because of paranoia. That would be pathological. But there are many non-pathological reasons that we mistrust. And so to come back to answer your question about why institutions of authority might have lost trust, well, yeah, sometimes that mistrust is earned. Sometimes it's violations of trust. We know, for example, that conspiracy theories about HIV are overrepresented in the African American population here in the US, and that has been traced back to trust violations between the African American community and the medical community, like the Tuskegee experiments, for example. So that's a real hard example, a concrete example of a trust violation. But beyond that, it's conflicts of interest, right? People within who are quote unquote anti-vaccine, one of their main complaints is, that doctors are all shills for drug companies, that the American medical establishment is intertwined with big pharma, which is true. And sometimes there are scandals, sometimes there is corruptions, and oftentimes there's a lack of transparency. I mentioned in the book that during COVID-19, I think that there was a misstep by the CDC and Anthony Fauci, where early on they said, don't wear masks. And in retrospect, it seemed like that was because there was really a concern that uh, especially good, and N95 masks would disappear from the market and therefore not be accessible to the medical community who's treating people in the hospitals. Whereas, perhaps transparency would have been a better move there. And I think the other thing that's crucial is that when I focus on false beliefs, I'm not focusing on, you know, religious beliefs or beliefs about UFOs or ghosts or whether or not that exists. That's not really my focus. I mean, it's an interesting topic, but it's not
Mhm.
not my focus. My focus is on beliefs where the truth is the truth is out there, as it were, right? Like you can find the truth, and yet people believe the false content anyway. So I think part of what we're seeing is also a kind of misunderstanding of the scientific process, right? If I'm talking about a topic like vaccines, or if I'm talking about a topic like climate change, and I'm talking about what science, quote unquote, or scientists are telling us, one of the things that happens in terms of public perception is there's often a kind of complaint that science is always changing our minds about something, right? In the medical establishment, it's like, well, you should take an aspirin a day. And then 10 years go by, it's like, nope, we're not recommending that anymore.
Mhm.
Or for women, hormone replacement therapy used to be highly recommended. Then it backs off. And that's interpreted as, see, these scientists don't know what they're talking about, right? But sort of ironically, the fact that science updates these beliefs or the quote unquote facts based on evidence is not, I would argue, a weakness. That's really the superpower of science. But I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding of that, going back to what I said before about standing up for your beliefs. We like absolutes. We like the person that says, this is the truth, and I stand by it. But that's not reality. And that's not actually how we learn about things and how things change over time as we become more informed.
Yeah, and you learn about this when you have a graduate level training in a hard science or a social science that is very, very uh, quantitative in nature. This idea that right, science is a process; it's not a book of facts. And when we say the truth is out there, we mean that there is a robust, tested, beat up idea that has withstood the test of time, not something etched into a stone that cannot change. It's the process that we're trusting and that led us to a conclusion, not the fact that it's written down somewhere. Because I think the public misinterprets that. They think that, oh, science is a book of facts or something like that. And, it's always moving. The question is, what is causing it to move? It's not causing it to move because someone wrote a competing article on a news site rather than, publish multiple studies in these journals. And so it just reminds me of how important this the formal process of doing science changes how you think about information, facts, and evidence. And unfortunately, it's just something that the public, it generates overconfidence because the public, at least motivated people that are really, that really want to have opinions on things, they don't necessarily see how they don't get to go behind the scenes of information that gets published in a journal and that becomes widely accepted.
Yeah, and I think there's also, if you are somebody who says, "Oh, well, okay, I get that nothing's immutable in science," right? I talk in the book about how when we think about our beliefs, we should think of them as probability judgments, not absolutes. But at the same time, that perspective can be sort of weaponized, right? Then it's like, oh, well, if everything is immutable and all it requires is another study, then yeah, then why do I have to believe quote unquote scientific consensus, right? And that's when doing my own research becomes potentially dangerous. I talk about in the book my college roommate who was a Nobel Prize winner in physics and I mean, he still emails me every couple of weeks with somebody who emails him saying that they've stumbled upon the real secret to the cosmos and, what dark matter is all about. And he talks about how, within a first couple sentences, it's clear that the person writing in has not taken even a basic physics course. So there is this sort of overconfidence, like that goes, if science is always open to new ideas and new evidence, then I'm gonna not believe it, and I'm gonna quote unquote do my own research. So yeah,
And
so I
talk
think
about practicing what you preach. In the book, you actually say that you reached out to someone knowledgeable in physics just to verify something, which I don't think, I've never met anybody that is so dedicated to the truth that they'll take these wild claims and actually take it to an expert.
right, right.
Uh,
Um, yeah.
well, so let's talk about solutions because we could talk for hours about these cognitive biases and how people they're drawn to information that supports their beliefs, but I think the solutions are really worth some discussion. Uh, my first question has to do with I guess it has to do with censorship. I really wanted your take on this because it's something that I go back and forth with, which is, should we encourage the visibility of bad ideas, of ideas that are clearly against what we know about reality? Um, because the visibility will help to expose that there is no conspiracy, that everyone, that basically laying all the cards out on the table, allowing, for example, flat earthers, which we talked about on the last episode, which is something that quite a bit about. Should we allow for these ideas to have a platform because light is what eventually ends up corroding bad ideas, and having everyone take a stab and see what these beliefs consist of? Or um, or is there some sort of obligation to suppress them? And I don't necessarily mean suppress all the ideas, but limit their visibility. In the book, you actually mentioned, which is not the same type of idea. You mentioned limiting the visibility of like hate speech, but it really got me thinking of how, as a society, we should deal with this movement of in support of ideas that we just consider inconsistent with objective reality.
Yes, a very, very good question and very, difficult question to answer in terms of, what we should do. I mean, my own personal take is that I would not advocate for encouraging the visibility of misinformation, but what I would encourage, back to what we were talking about in terms of trust violations and institutions of authority, is engaging with people who have false beliefs. I don't think we should just encourage that they spout them, but I think we should engage with people, and institutions of authority should be transparent, and they should also be, let the public in the door, so to speak, or, sitting at the table, so to speak, and having more discussions, whether it's about vaccines or climate change or what have you. So I think that kind of engagement is really key. At the same time, I do think that there is great value in content moderation or fact checking, meaning depending on where we're talking about, where in the informational ecosystem we're talking about, I think there is value to somebody making a decision about what should or should not appear in that space. And if that sounds like, gosh, that's limiting free speech, the analogy or sort of concrete example I would offer is schools, right? I don't necessarily think that a anything goes attitude should be allowed in schools. I don't think that a teacher should just be able to teach whatever the heck they believe, right? I believe that it makes sense to have curriculum that are, approved by school boards and have input from parents and that kind of thing. So, and I don't think anyone really thinks that a teacher should just be able to spout whatever they want to in a classroom. So I think if we use that example, we can accept that content moderation has its place and has value. Of course, the tricky thing in all of this is it then depends on who's doing the content moderation, right? On the one hand, I'm saying we should have content moderation. On the other hand, I wouldn't say that, banning books is a good idea necessarily. So it goes back to who's doing it and back to what we were saying about science, right? Then it becomes like, well, which scientists do I believe? Because you're always going to find some handful of somebody who, there's Nobel Prize winners who tell us that climate change isn't real, even though they weren't doing any of their scientific research in an area relevant to climate change, whatever. So it's the idea like, ooh, they're a Nobel Prize winner. They might be really smart, and therefore I'll pay attention to them. And then you're going to ignore 99.5% of the climate scientists who say that climate change is real. So it can be very tricky in terms of, decide. This is again why I talk about mistrust, deciding who to trust to do that content moderation. And, I am a proponent of free speech. I don't think it's a good idea to just have state-controlled media or something like that. I think it's a terrible idea. But so I think we have to be thoughtful and careful about how we do this. And, personally, I sort of miss coverage that is more both-sided, right? Like I think there's still a PBS show that's called Left, Right, and Center, right? That sort of presents these different perspectives and then tries to reach consensus. At the same time, that kind of framework can be difficult, right? Because you have someone with some very fringe idea that says, okay, come on and debate me, right? And then it sort of like becomes equivalent, right? As if both sides are equally legitimate, which I don't think is a good way. So it's very, very tricky. But I think overall censorship can have a backfire effect. Certainly that's true with conspiracy theories, right? If the information's suppressed, then it must be right, that kind of thing. So I think we have to be very thoughtful about how we do that. I will say that really, in terms of research evidence, the most effective ways to reduce belief in misinformation aren't really about limiting content. They're about what we call inoculation strategies, or sometimes we call them pre-bunking instead of debunking, because it talks about it's really strategies focus on priming people so that when they do encounter misinformation, they might be able to recognize it, rather than they've already been exposed and then down the line you say, oh, but that's not right, right? We want to make people better consumers of information so they can be better at recognizing what's good information and what's not. And ironically, this is where the inoculation comes in. One of the best ways to teach people how to do that is actually how to teach them to make disinformation. So this has actually been done in the
Yeah.
classroom level to some extent, where if you teach people like here's sort of the tricks people use when they're, trying to sell false beliefs, then they're better at recognizing, those techniques when they see them. So that's kind of what inoculation techniques mean when we talk about misinformation.
Uh, let's end by talking about the actual one-on-one piece. So you might have someone in your life that you're close with that believes in something that you've deemed to be very extreme. Um, what are some things to keep in mind when engaging with someone who might be what you would call a true believer, who just seems to be very stubborn in their beliefs and very rigid and always just kind of bringing up ideas that support their views? I'm curious as to your thoughts because it strikes me that part of the solution is something that I've learned about talking with children, which is that when a child comes up to you and says something that is that has the air of being irrational, they say that the teacher's out to get them or something at school, like they're not fair, they're giving me these bad grades or something, and they're picking on me. I've heard someone speaking on this topic, and their advice was, deal with the emotion first because that child is not in a space to have a conversation about the objectivity of if their teacher is actually against them or not. You have to calm them down first, allow them to or validate their emotions, allow them to speak and feel like they're heard. And then 20 minutes, an hour the next day, then you revisit it when the temperature is lower. It feels to me like the solution to having these conversations, uh, the solution is similar to having these conversations with people that have very extreme viewpoints.
Yeah, I think that's a good tip. And this question of, how do I engage with someone who believes XYZ is probably the most frequent answer question that I'm asked. And certainly there was a time a couple of years ago, sort of at the height of the QAnon phenomenon. I was doing a lot of media interviews at that time, and that was what everyone always wanted to know. So my answer to that is really starts with, well, what are you really asking? Like, what are you trying to achieve when you ask, what do I do with this person? Because I think often what the person is trying to achieve is to somehow talk them out of their belief or change their mind. And so for myself as a psychiatrist I do full-time clinical work, I mean, I think you don't even have to be a clinician to know this. That's not how you get people to change their minds by confronting them and saying, hey, your belief is crazy, right? So like you're saying with the kid analogy, it has to start with not having a goal of changing their minds, but starting with a goal of, I would like to understand what this person believes and why they believe it. And that involves then listening, right, in a non-judgmental fashion. Or, if the real issue and the reason you're asking this question is not so much that you're dead set on changing the beliefs, but you're worried about your family member who's gone down the rabbit hole and, it's not socializing anymore, then, maybe just call them up and say, hey, let's agree not to talk about QAnon or whatever it is. And let's just go have lunch or something like that and talk about, baseball, So, but I think if there is this longer term desire to challenge that belief, the way you do that is first establishing that trust, right? If you think about our own beliefs and have we ever modified our belief or have we ever gotten our, if we ever dropped a bad habit or changed our behavior, usually we do that when we encounter someone who we trust, who we believe cares about us and has been down that same path, you know, and has that same personal experience. So that's where we have to start. And once you're there, okay, now we can start maybe challenging the beliefs because when you challenge them, it doesn't feel like an attack. It feels like coming from this person who cares about me and is compassionate. And incidentally, when I'm mentioning all of this, I'm talking about like in-person, face-to-face interactions. Because a lot of times when we are doing this sort of engagement with people, what we're really talking about is, on Twitter, or X, or on Facebook in the comments with somebody who I don't even know, right? And then it becomes this sort of confrontational, anonymous thing that just spirals downward from there. So I think it's about really trying to engage with people in a good faith, compassionate kind of way. And once that's in place, now maybe we can, challenge their beliefs. Of course, you run the risk then of your own beliefs being challenged, which, maybe not a bad thing either.
Well, the name of the book, once again, is False: How Mistrust, Disinformation, and Motivated Reasoning Make Us Believe Things That Aren't True. Thank you once again for being on, Joe Pierre.
Thanks so much for having me again. It was a pleasure.
For more on Joe, visit drjoepierre.com. That's drjoepierre.com. Or pick up a copy of his book, False: How Mistrust, Disinformation, and Motivated Reasoning Make Us Believe Things That Aren't True, wherever books are sold. If you enjoy this podcast, please share an episode with two of your friends. Head over to patreon.com/whydowethatpodcast to become a paid supporter of the show. You'll gain early access to episodes as well as bonus video content. Follow on Instagram or Facebook at Why Do We Do That Podcast, or on X at WDWDTPod. Until next time, this is Dr. Ryan Moyer, hoping you found some answers to the question, why do we do that?